Hello and welcome to the Catholic Art Institute podcast. I'm your host, Kathleen Carr, and I'm so pleased today to be joined by Juliette Aristides. I think those of us that have been following this organization know Juliette and her work, but for those that don't, Juliette is a classically trained painter. She's the founder of Atelier Aristides. Her work has been featured in numerous collections and magazines, including Fine Art Connoisseur, American Art Collector, Artist Magazine, and American Artist. She was recently showcased with a Lifetime solo show in Tennessee, which we'll discuss, amongst many other amazing books, which I can put in the description below. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me today, Juliette.
Thanks, Kathleen, and I've been an admirer of your work for a long time as well, so thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. Well, one of the things, in addition to your amazing skills that I've seen, is that you seem to have a variety, sort of a cluster of gifts. So your painting and then your ability to communicate about your painting. You're very introspective. You have this great power of observation and communication, which is also seen in your books. So I was wondering if you could just begin by talking a little bit more about your journey as an artist, because you have a remarkable career and you're very germane to sort of the resurgence of the Atelier movement, studying with Jacob Collins and Anthony Visco prior to that, who's a friend of this. So how did you come to be committed to this classical realism and the pursuit of beauty?
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. It wasn't a straight path, and for many people, if you talk to artists, there's not one way that people kind of stumble upon the direction that they are meant to be going, and I'm no exception. And I grew up as a kid in Pennsylvania and loved to, of course, draw, but also really loved to just walk in the woods and look at things and write about things. And it wasn't exactly clear that I was going to be an artist. It could have been a writer or someone who actually just spent a lot of time looking into the air and doing not a lot of anything, which can be the case for many people who spend their lives thinking about things. I was lucky enough as a teenager to get to hear about a private studio that was outside of Allentown by a guy named Myron Barnstone. And it was my first introduction to really high-level serious instruction. But anyway, I absolutely loved it. I loved the process of devoting all day to the study of art and art history and design systems. And he kind of funneled everybody that went through his studio to Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. So I went and did 3 years there. And from there, heard about the ateliers that were happening in Minneapolis through a friend of mine. And so went to the ateliers at that time out, left Philadelphia with a sleeping bag and portfolio case and no place to live. And that's how it happened. So that was my introduction to the ateliers. I was amazed to find that there were these little pockets of studios that were devoted to representational art and to beauty at a time when that was extremely uncool. And there they were, and there's no internet at that point, so you couldn't research any of these things. So I went and studied there, and a really dear friend, Robert Armetta, said, okay, I put your name on a waiting list for a class at National Academy of Design, which is on the was on the Upper East Side, just a magnificent institution. When your name comes up, just go to it. And you know, you have to be a kid to think that's a great plan. But my name came up, and I went to it, and it was the class that was run by Jacob Collins. And so I met him as well as a bunch of other people. And then I passed on to him also the Lack article on the training of painters and his background with studying in small studios. And a group of us went with him at that point to study in his townhouse. He kind of broke off. The first genesis of Water Street Atelier was a small group that met in the top floor of his townhouse in his studio. And that was kind of the beginning of Water Street. And then I never saw Grand Central. That was after my time.
Right. but it's become quite the Atelier program up there. Just looking at the student work is so impressive. So it's wonderful to see that propagated, because just thinking about your comment that, ideologically and what was happening, I think it was probably Clement Greenberg's statement or that article that he wrote, where he just sort of made this argument that unless you're with the avant-garde, you are just kitsch. So there just wasn't room for beauty or realism at all. It was really becoming disparaged, and I think all disciplines started to become, taking on that ideology, which is, it's not really a fair argument at all, and it's really been the result of this. So thankfully, there's people like you. And
yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I know from working with so many students that when they end up in my classes or my Atelier class, that for many of them, or for perhaps me, that would mark the beginning of their life as an artist. But in reality, that's not the case. The formal aspect of training is often only like the final expression of a heart that is actually already in a way an artist, but doesn't have the skill to be able to exercise that. And when I look back on my life, I used to think the first time I showed up at the Barnstone Studios and was given actual skills, it was so exhilarating. Giving me a language and a voice to be able to express myself was when I became an artist. But it isn't true. In a weird way, like the little awkward kid in the woods that had trouble fitting in, but felt so comfortable looking at things and just absolutely delighting in what I was seeing. There were so many places I didn't feel at home that when I sat in front of a painting or I sat in front of, a beautiful tree, that it felt like I was coming back to myself. And so in a way, my whole education was, you could say, a way to give form to something that I felt so long ago, but unable to express. So for me, I started off at the Barnstone Studios and then was led to Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art for 3 years. And in those days, we didn't have the internet, and we didn't really know what was out there. It was all word of mouth and that kind of thing. And so practicing year after year. So I did Pennsylvania Academy. I started from cast drawing, and I did that year after year. Then heard about the ateliers in Minneapolis. And at that point, it didn't feel like you could just show up at one place and get the whole thing in a way that you can now. It felt like the information, the old school kind of information was almost like I envisioned it in my mind like maybe a watch or a clock that had been broken and the pieces kind of scattered. And that for those of us at the time, we were all hunting for these little pieces. And in Minneapolis, it was the first time, seeing these ateliers that I saw these like-minded individuals that didn't mind being extremely uncool and spending large amounts of time and money to just gain tiny bits of skill and information. And we would rival each other to see who could wake up earliest in the morning to go and render this cast and that kind of thing. So years doing that, and then hearing about the studios in New York City, and went to study with one and in one. And then a great friend of mine, Robert Armetta, told me to go and study at the National Academy of Design. He put my name on a waiting list, and I didn't ask any questions because you're a kid. If someone says your name's on a waiting list, you're like, fine, here I am. And it ended up being Jacob Collins, and I spent 5 years with him from National Academy of Design. We went, a small group of us, to study in the top floor of his brownstone on Polimas Place. Then that became Water Street, and the latest iteration of that is, the amazing Grand Central. So along the way, I had learned a tremendous amount, and that became the seeds of the atelier that I planted in Seattle.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Thanks for sharing that.
Thanks.
I love hearing about all the details, and it's remarkable that you were led to study with Jacob. Just really has done so much, like yourself, to inform and teach a whole new generation, and a lot of people spreading out and starting their own atelier programs coming from that. It's really great.
Yeah,
Thanks for
it's
sharing that.
important, Kathleen, to remember that the initial ateliers were started by Richard Lack, that he's the father of the American atelier movement. And that is important to know because we're enough generations in, even like, it's like light, light years in a short amount of time. We're seeing more and more and more, but very few people know that it was kept alive by one man who opened studios in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I know. It's really amazing. So thanks for that background, but I wanted to move on to your recent show, A Life's Work at the Custom House Museum in Nashville, Tennessee. What an amazing honor. I had the great fortune of being able to participate in your Zoom opening, where you were able to have that great interview and conversation with Peter Trippi at Fine Art Connoisseur. I was really moved by some of your remarks about freezing a moment in time and, just the powers of observation as we've all been sort of locked away with COVID. I was wondering if maybe you could just talk about some of the pieces. I think your piece, The Atelier in particular, was something that you said was noted and cherished.
Yeah, kind of there's a lot in that question. I think that for many artists, the idea of noticing and seeing and loving is kind of linked to this idea of preserving and trying to hold on to something and make it eternal, or maybe perhaps the opposite, just capture a quality that's eternal in the object and hold on to that. In terms of stillness in painting, paintings feel still, but they're different than the photographic stillness you get with the click of a camera. When you do a painting and you're doing it from life, the process happens sometimes over weeks or even months. And so the painting itself might be a fixed image, but it's made of these composites of experiences. And so for me, that picture of the atelier, I had walked into that room. I've probably walked into that room without exaggeration 1,000 times. And so each time going in, I see it. And this year we found out that the building might be sold. I don't know if that's the case or not. But that feeling of something that you love that might be lost, and the desire to record what it felt like to walk into that space. So for me, yeah, it's a desire to freeze a moment, but it's also a desire, perhaps more than that, to be able to capture my response to how I feel in that space or in that moment. And I think that experience can be shared and related to by many people. I mean, if you have the passing of a family member, and I had a friend that passed away, and I remember just picking up his sweatshirt and realizing it smelled just like him, and just wanting to hold on to that, and that feeling of the sweatshirt actually doesn't mean very much. It's the whole embodied experience of who he was. And it's the same thing with these paintings. Chesterton talked about all optimism being born from a secret pessimism. And I think the love of beauty kind of springs from a fear of, or an acute sense of ugliness, or the desire to preserve is reacted upon by a deep hatred of losing things. It's to create a sense of permanence in the face of impermanence. And so I think that that painting in particular, it would just be a microcosm of all those kinds of paintings, whether it's, a daffodil on the ledge of a window or a pot on a stove. It's my response, or the artist's response to that becomes significant. And yeah.
Yeah, it's really well said. You have done so well to capture that, and especially the sense of light is really something that you do so well. And I think we all as artists feel that desire to capture that moment of beauty, or that light, or the things that we see, and to try to treasure and keep them forever, because we do know that they're fleeting. So it's just a great observation. There was another piece in your show that you discussed that was the room in your atelier that you said was in a bit of disarray when you first arrived, but you were hoping to make it into a monastery of sorts. Could you just talk a little bit more about that? Like, I just thought that was a beautiful painting and also just an interesting vision for the room.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually kind of interesting. When we moved, my atelier was in a small, was in a studio building, and prior to moving over to where its current location, next to St. Mark's Cathedral. And so when we moved the atelier, we had the opportunity to take a space and create what we wanted with it. And I'm a firm believer that architecture speaks to us as much as painting does, as much as an essay can. And I took the atelier and went to the Frye Museum, which is a small collection here in Seattle. And the building was designed by a guy named Rick Sundberg. And at the time, I didn't know that, but I kind of let everyone loose with their notebooks and said, okay, as you go in and spend a half hour and come up with a theory on what this building is saying to you. You know, do you walk in directly from the street? Is there a kind of threshold experience as you're transitioning from the street into the museum? And so as we started looking around and noticing, we realized, yeah, I mean, in fact, you don't just like tumble from the street in front of a painting. There's many things that prepare your heart and mind to be able to receive it as a work of art and to be able to have an experience in front of it. You know, you stand in front of the work of art, the way that they're spaced. And we actually, one of my students who ended up attending, his father was the one who designed that museum. So we later got a chance to walk through with him, and everything that we picked up on was a deliberate act on his part. So he designed that there's a still pool of water that you walk next to before you get into the museum. One of his sons is disabled, so he has everyone going up through this ramp, this slow kind of lead up to the museum so that everyone comes in as equals. He has an overhang so that no matter how bright it is outside, your eye adjusts to the level of light as you go in. The heaviness of the doors, so you feel like you're going through a bank vault. And, you know, all that to transition you. And so with our studio, what we did is something in our small kind of budget-friendly way, had this space, and we could have allocated it all to studio space, but instead we tried to transition from the street into the space so that you felt set apart for your studies and elevated. So that table, you know, countless conversations on the philosophy behind art and our responses to art have happened there. It's ended up not only being an aesthetic choice to transition you, but an actual place which made something happen because of it being there. So at any rate, the place was a mess, and that idea, I've always loved linking the idea of, I love monasteries, of course, and that idea, that passion, you know, we think in this world, like, to be, you know, impassioned, you have to go march with a giant sign or to do something else, but there's all sorts of quiet passions, people who withdraw in order to light a particular flame. And so this idea of being able to give people permission to not be relevant, to fix their eyes on something that felt eternal, and to study, if necessary, for years and years. And so all that was happening within the way we designed the space to reflect, you know, my point of view, but also those for the people who it was a siren call to.
Yeah, I agree with the fact that the environment matters so much. I mean, the buildings, of course. I mean, with this organization, we always want to showcase that there's a need for beauty and, you know, and the way the design sort of does what you were talking about with the museum. It calms you, it quiets you, it puts you in a place of reverence. There's a bit of a, you know, we have the vestibule before going into the main part of the church, and there's certain areas that segue from one to the other, oftentimes up a very big flight of stairs. So you get that moment of feeling you've really arrived into a place that's going to inspire that awe and prayer and reverence and all of that, which is necessary. I mean, you know, whether it's with, this faith tradition or just art in general, I just think that there's a real need to quiet, and you talk about this all the time, just the observing, and that this is a slower thing. It's a different thing that we're focusing on, not just snapping away pictures, and we're bombarded with so much imagery that I think we can talk about this as we segue towards your book. But I was just going to maintain just one more question about your recent show. Peter Trippi pointed out that you keep your work a little less descriptive, so I guess it wouldn't be such hard-edged. And I just was wondering if you would just talk a little about that, like that decision-making, what about that aesthetic? Everybody's got their own hand. It's just something that I think is really interesting. I'd love to hear a little more.
Yeah, that difference between kind of the perfectly realized, hard-edged, every aspect of a painting revealed as if it's under bright light. He referenced that he wasn't a huge fan of pre-Raphaelite work with their love of detail and minutiae, but that in and of itself was wasn't arrived at accidentally. That whole period in England, there was a love of medieval work, the clarity of that, and the love of nature, which not wanting to have anything be overlooked. There's also enormous fascination with the natural sciences and kind of wanting to know what and why things are. And so there was a lot of elements that led to that, those decisions in terms of finely realized, work. But, and then, of course, they were reacting against work that celebrated the general effect, the big swings between light and dark, and having one focal point, a hierarchy in terms of a focal point. And actually, those two types of works can be looked at in terms discussed on that alone. But there's always seems to be a little bit of a moral judgment associated with it. And so you imagine these two different camps, the pre-Raphaelite saying to what he called the work by Joshua Reynolds, which anchored the British school of painting, called him Sir Sloshalot, with the brown sauce and, but that having work that's kind of seen as less finished versus more finished. And so you still see that happening today, work being produced that is perfectly realized. And that often tends to be seen as a love of the intellect and love of fully realized form being slow devotion in a work of art. And it's kind of minimized by those that are moved by passion and emotion, and they love the energy of paint as it goes on the surface. So the one could say to the other, your work is so cold, it's so finely realized. And the other one could say to the more impassioned work that get a hold of yourself, look at your work, it's all emotion, there's no reason. And often it's not quite that clear cut. But really, in a weird way, you could examine the whole history of art in terms of those kind of divisions between the head and the heart and how people choose to express that. With me, I've always tried to make my work more finely realized and a love of form and precision. But deep in my nature, I'm a romantic, and I can't help but love the beginning parts of a painting and have a harder time with that. So at any rate, I love them both, and my painting ends up based on my temperament, often to reflect a broader application of paint. Is that a little bit too detailed for you?
No, I think it's just really interesting because when, my work can be a little more finished looking, and I, of course, don't have the longer portfolio of stuff that I've done, but, I'm just sort of thinking, my approach to this, sometimes it's like, well, have I finished it too much that painterliness can be lost? There's somewhere in between that is a place that I love, is where it's still some sense of painterliness, but still finished enough that it's realistic. It's just still something that I'm exploring, and I'm sure, you're right. Temperament has so much to do with it, because I'll get off to a certain start, but then, you're forcing yourself to finish down, and you have this beautiful finished thing. But then sometimes I think, well, something been lost. I don't know. That's just my 2 cents.
Well, that's an astute observation. So Albert Boehm, in his book on 19th century academic art, he really lays out this really clear path of how, in 19th century academic art, the sketch or working from imagination or doing these kind of quick studies was part of the academic process. And then, of course, working from nature, working from imagination, doing detailed studies, and then doing a finished work. Based on all of those, and so you'd never exhibit a sketch because it was just an initial first thought, and but then what ended up happening is people noticed exactly that. They noticed, hey, we finished our work, but there was something in the sketch that took me 3 hours. The finished one took me 6 months, and I like the sketch better. Or there's something that's lost in terms of life. And so you began to find this kind of closing or working backward where people would start to capture the energy from the sketch but finish it. And so when you have work by romantic artists, they lean more heavily on the sketch. And so that death by paint application or death by finish is something that is a real thing. And that kind of jostling between both of those spectrums is an important aspect. Finishing a work of art is very difficult, and in a way it's a more difficult skill set because there is always something that could be lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think that's why that this is a lifelong pursuit, because as you do things, your work can then change, or you're informed by your own mistakes and the things that you do. Well, I think this conversation segues nicely into 2 things I'd like to talk about. First of all, this idea of slowing down, examining, I think that your most recent book on the sketchbook is something I'd love to focus on. So could you just tell me, like, what, why that topic and, anything about that book?
Yeah, initially when I did the first books, there was... I was just trying to record the process that I went through, capture some of atelier training, but it tended to be, it was more academic. And I was really just trying to etch the link between historical traditional work and the work being done today as being one line. And so people could kind of contextualize the work that they see around them in terms of realism and the work that had gone back for a millennia. And I didn't actually think you could learn to draw through any other method than actually being in a studio. And over time, my position changed, and I realized there's a lot that you can get from a book in terms of actually technically learning about the, how to make art. And that book, the sketchbook, wouldn't have been possible a decade ago because people were reading more. You could sit and get a book and actually read from beginning to end, but we're used to getting information now in smaller bite-sized pieces of information. The impetus behind that book was that there's an aspect of art that is useful not only to experts, to collectors, or to artists who make the work, but that actually anybody, no matter who they are, could benefit from learning to draw. And one of the main things that drawing teaches people, even for those who are not practitioners, is what happens when you're used to looking at life very quickly. What happens when you choose to slow it down? So if you can identify an object and identify what an object is in a fraction of a millisecond, you can actually identify what something is quicker than your brain can actually think it. It is so instantaneous. But the skill, like kind of secret superpower that artists have, is that at that point they can stop and then look at that object for another week. Now, what's happening in that week when an artist is staring at an object? It's a lot like what happens when you have somebody who chooses to study philosophy, or they're born kind of innately studying philosophy. Many people will take things for granted. that the universe and the world is exactly as it appears to be. But now all of a sudden you ask these grand questions and you begin to unravel things a little bit, and a world that looks so fixed and ordinary and so boring becomes something that's living, it's alive, and you've got an access point to it, and your ability to think about it changes the way you see it, and it starts as kind of fire in the spirit. Where anybody can be living in a place that is wonderful and beautiful, miraculous, not because you've got a higher paycheck than the next person, but because now you have the eyes to see what's around you and realizing the gift of everyday life. So for me, it became this really imperative thing, that this gift that I thought that art could give to everybody is a sense of reverence for our own ordinary lives, and then teach people how to slow down, because that's not obvious. And it tends to be a gift that's given to artists and poets, people who struggle for just the right word and could struggle for a long time for just the right word. And so anyway, that was the impetus behind the book, in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's really good. And it's a necessary step, as you said. You know, it's one thing to just learn how to lay out your palette and do other things, but that's it's just a unique thing that I saw that you did with having people focus on their drawing and keeping a sketchbook, and how important that is. I mean, Andrew Wyeth comes to mind with this. You know, he was somebody that would go out into nature and there's a dead bird, and he would sketch a bit, and then go back, and some of it out of his imagination too. He was really studying back and forth. And you see these glorious paintings that are so moving, and it's a dead bird, you know. But there is something that's sort of beautiful and moving. But he really had that amazing gift for sort of everyday things and really transforming them into something special and, you know, with a real artist vision. How do you think photography impacts what we're doing as painters? It certainly has. It's kind of a discussion that comes up, and it seems fitting to kind of talk about this now. What is your take on working from photography and just in general how it's affected painting?
Yeah, I've come to realize that there's now two major traditions that the realist artist is given. One is that kind of handed down from the Renaissance, which was based on observation of nature and design systems that's extrapolated across, like that comes from studying a lot of nature, that gets created into these principles that then get handed down, or based on the history of art, the study and accomplishment of other artists. And then there's a tradition of photography. And so most artists, I see those as kind of two distinct lines at this point. And it's not that they never can intermingle. Certainly in the past, artists have used photography in their art, but has never been divorced from serious artistic training and learning those kind of skills. And so, you know, today, especially working from life in, you know, the time of a pandemic, you're going to use photographs when working from the figure because most people don't have the model. But it's important to also consider, you know, why people, you know, work. For example, how many people are moved by the photograph to create a work of art? Is it not that you're moved by life to then take the photograph to create a work of art? And so for me, the working from life kind of gets rid of the middleman. That kind of flattens things out. It's difficult, it's messy, it's complicated, but you're going, you know, nature has always, nature in the tradition of Renaissance art being handed down that way, nature was kind of the grand mistress, the inspiration, you know, that kind of thing. And so the closer you got to nature, the truer, the more beautiful it was. And then even if you look at it in terms of spiritual life, you know, God speaking into the human heart, I mean, there's still, you know, there's still physical properties at work. And so with photography, you know, I don't personally care if somebody works from a photograph or works from life, and at all. I just note that the quality of our experiences as an artist matters as much as the image, and we're very much an image-based culture at this point. It's all image, and so giving people permission to not only the work painted from life is often less sophisticated looking than work that's done from photography, and most people will never tell the difference. So just to encourage the artist, find what gives you pleasure. And if you work from photograph, also try to infuse it with a little bit of life, and also to go back and get a little bit of the nuts and bolts of intellectual training that you can infuse into your work. That being said, there are there are artists who are photographers, like Dorothea Lange, for example. She is every bit as much of an artist as someone like a Fontaine Latour. Her work is absolutely magnificent. Her photography is a perfect medium for her vision. And so it's really more about a match. At this point, photography is not going to go away, and it ultimately doesn't matter who uses what. I just encourage people to enjoy the experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. I mean, and in no way was I ever trying to disparage photography in and of itself, or even having to use it. I think there's just a reality in it. Like it or not, it's also affected, realism in the modern day. I would agree with you, though, and I know from my own experience, because there's times when I have been forced to use photographs, that my life training from life and the understanding of form and the model and those types of things have helped me immensely to use my imagination to transform the photo. So I'm interpreting it. I'm not just simply copying it. Because I think you can see that sometimes when people, they don't really have the training and they're copying a photograph, and then there's this weirdness that will happen with photography that they're rotely emulating in the painting, and things just don't look right. Plus, the eye sees so many more colors. I mean, I think we've all snapped a picture of something, a sunset, and the colors are compressed. It's not what you're seeing at all, which is like another reason to make sketches, take your sketchbook out. And
I totally agree. A painting from a photograph is not the same. And I'd really, encourage everybody to take that risk, even if it looks a little bit awkward, because when we talk about life being frozen and how when painting from life, it never really is frozen. When you paint from a photograph, it's frozen. You have a middleman, it
Right.
is. So for better or worse, the complexity of light and the beauty of light and all that is just not going to be there.
Right.
And so enjoy the process. There's too much pressure on people to produce the finished product, the image, and there's a little bit of a loss of that whole calling to be a painter, not just a maker of images.
Yeah, it's well said. Okay, I know we're kind of running over here. I just thought if you had any closing remarks for emerging artists wanting to dedicate their life to the pursuit of beauty, there can be challenges. What would you recommend? What would you say?
Yeah, I think that we're living in a really interesting time to be an artist because of, we were already moving into the digital world pre-COVID, but that has been greatly, greatly accelerated for better or worse. So now with platforms, we had the different internet platforms really has freed artists from the tyranny of this sort of curator class, which can suppress an artist's career or advance certain artists' career over others. So now everybody has the opportunity to connect directly with their audience. That also puts an enormous amount of pressure to compete. I notice with my students in the studio, it's harder to get students to take time now. They're very their work is now up against everybody's work in the entire world who's doing anything remotely like them, in this type of training. And so there's not this slow percolation over a period of years as artists are allowed to disappear into their studies and not be brilliant. It's important to not be brilliant when you're studying because there's there's only things that you get through hard, messy labor over time. And normally when the work gets too good too fast, it's an affectation. It's not really an integrated understanding on the part of the artist. So one thing for emerging artists is to consider step back and ask questions related to their media diet, so to speak, and to try to insulate and protect themselves in some way from that necessity to feed the algorithm in order to be able to have your work be affirmed very early on. So that's one thing to watch out for. Another thing is to get, kind of a healthy diet by also reading. And I know that's hard with our attention spans being pulled in so many different directions. And, we're in a time of, emergencies, one emergency after another, and the slow pull of a different timeline, a timeline that's linked to eternity. And so by going and reading people that you love that have something to say, you can begin to have a dialogue through the ages. It's very important as artists to be able to not only be producing, but also to be fed and to be inspired and to have an inner dialogue with yourself. And so if I could give any blessing to an artist, it would be, may you have time, may you have space to hear your own thoughts and develop your own opinion, and to have a response that means something to you, to the world that you live in, that you can then put out there. And I promise you that if you do that, there'll be other people years from now who are able to see that in your work and long for that. And ironically, that can end up making your work last. So that would be my 2 cents.
Wow, that's really beautiful and well said. I think it's great advice, along with so much that you were able to offer in your various books, which I highly recommend, and I'll put in the links below. So I don't want to take any more of your time, Juliette, but I'm really grateful for it. Thank you so much for sharing all of this and your time with me today. It's been great to talk to you and catch up.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you too, Kathleen. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.